Hi, my name is Alex Dolphin and welcome back to another episode of Ex Ante. Today we're going to discuss the case of Shelley v. Kraemer. This case was heard in the United States Supreme Court in the year of 1948. Let's go ahead and jump into the facts of the case. So the Shelleys are the defendants and the Kraemers are the plaintiffs in this case. The Shelleys were a black family in St. Louis, Missouri, and they purchased a home in the 1940s. This home that they purchased was underneath a restrictive covenant. A covenant basically is just a promise that two landowners make to one another, saying that, hey, I won't do this on my property, you won't do that on your property. So this covenant was a racially restrictive covenant. What that means is there were 39 property owners in this neighborhood in St. Louis that had entered into a covenant that said, only white people will be able to own this property. We won't have any people of color living in this property. So when the Shelleys purchased a home underneath this restrictive covenant, the other individuals in the neighborhood moved to enforce the restrictive covenant and get them basically kicked out of the property and have that property resold to someone who was not a person of color, someone who was white. So the Shelleys make an argument on the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, claiming that this racially restrictive covenant was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So the court has to grapple with that argument. In the Supreme Court, they start off their decision saying that the covenant itself between the property owners, because there is no government involvement in that covenant does not breach the Equal Protection Clause. It doesn't breach it's not a violation of the 14th Amendment. However, the court says that when these property owners tried to get the state to enforce their covenant, that if the state was to enforce that covenant, that would be a violation of the 14th Amendment, because the state would be using its power to deprive the Shelleys, these people of color, the opportunity to own property. And so they say that that's the violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So the court rules that racially restrictive covenants cannot stand. This was a great victory in the civil rights movement and an early case in the civil rights movement. Let's go ahead and jump into some ex ante implications of this case. So the first one would be, it really was great progress for this country. It moved our country in a great way to get rid of some terrible racism. And I think it's bad to say that like someone's black, we're just not going to let them live in that neighborhood. That's obviously terrible, not productive for society as a whole. Now, to play the devil's advocate and to make an argument against this case, and not really to the racial aspect, but just to the precedential value that this case has, well, if the government doesn't enforce covenants, how are these going to be enforced, right? It seems like these people who are trying to enforce the covenants are going to have to resort to self-help, which could be more violent, it could be more dangerous. So by the government denying the enforcement of these covenants, they are actually incentivizing these property owners who were privy to this covenant to take the actions and matters into their own hand. And that could get really ugly and really nasty. So that's one of the first ex ante implications that I wanted to point out. The second one would be that, this doesn't just apply to race. So let's think, for instance, there's a group of Sikhs, right? Sikhism is a small religion in the United States generally, but let's say that there's this community of Sikhs, maybe like 50 people that say, hey, we're going to move to this rural part of the United States. We're going to buy up a bunch of property and we're going to put a covenant that basically says this is a Sikh town. If you're going to be in this town, you need to be religious and you need to be a believer in the Sikh faith. What if someone came along, maybe a Christian, maybe a Muslim, and they wanted to purchase a property that was within that restrictive covenant? Underneath the logic in Shelley, I don't think that the Sikhs would be able to have the court enforce that covenant, if you know what I mean. Let's just take this a step further. Let's say that there's a lot of maybe communist type of folks in the United States that think that a commune would be a good way to live. So they buy up some property in, let's say, another rural part of the United States, and they want to create this community. And they put all the property underneath the covenant that says, if you're not a communist, you can't live on this property. Well, what happens when someone who is maybe just a socialist or maybe a capitalist wants to try and move into that property? Well, the government couldn't could not enforce, based upon the Shelley decision, that covenant, right? Because it would be depriving the capitalist or the socialist, or in the case of the Sikhs, the Muslim or the Christian, from equal protection from the government for its purchase of property. So something to think about there. Definitely a lot of precedential value. Definitely moves society towards a more racially integrated one. So this is an interesting case, and it is hallmark in the civil rights movement. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.